Hi, good afternoon. Welcome back to the second session for the unit, which is contemporary issues in human resources management. Continuing with what we've covered in Learning Outcome 1, just very briefly going through that. In Learning Outcome 1, we basically looked at how contemporary issues impact the organization and how HR then deals with some of these contemporary issues. The part one of the learning outcome, I kind of covered with you in the session in a bit more detailed fashion because we were wanting to look at basic things like what is a contemporary issue, how do you define a contemporary issue. We also then looked at some of the factors which affect and how these factors then are taken into account by the Human Resources Department in dealing with some of these contemporary issues. Now, we discussed some of the issues which were related primarily to, legislation, technological advances, economical conditions, work-life balance, sexual harassment, discrimination. But in the second part of the presentation, then we looked at, some of the 21st century factors which are being considered, which are basically being considered, and they are actually arising as what you call our contemporary issues. So one of the factors that we looked at was basically workforce diversity, and this is a major challenge which HR and most organizations have within, within the departments and within the company in terms of workforce. We also basically looked at understanding, within that workforce diversity, we look at, gender bias, we look at race and ethnicity, and to a certain extent, we also looked at, we also looked at, some of the things in some places are cropping up, which is in terms of, religion and religious beliefs. And we also looked at, socioeconomic backgrounds, which basically meant that these could be the modern contemporary issues which most 21st century HR managers actually face within the organization. We also looked at, with some of the things which are now being prominently discussed and talked about, like the LGBT rights and the sexual orientation. Some organizations look at putting and taking a lot of such data in terms of, basic demographics and personal data while you fill up a job application form, and how some of these things can lead to a bit of discrimination and, again, can crop up as contemporary issues. So these are things that we discussed primarily, from a point of view of Learning Outcome 1. One of the key examples that is currently being debated in a lot of developed countries is the pay gap difference between men and women, which work within the same roles and, same type of industry and same organization. And this is also turning out to be a major contemporary issue. Now, continuing with that theme, what we are looking at doing is primarily going into Learning Outcome 2. And here, what we want to be able to understand is what is the contribution of Human Resources Department in the development of the organizational strategy. So here, in particular, we will look at two learning objectives. One is look at the tools which are used by HR department, for doing environmental analysis, and then how these tools can be used to examine, the organizational strategic development or strategy development. Now, before I get into this particular topic, what I want to do is basically just briefly recap the importance of HRM. Now, human resources have become one of the most important resources because they have the ability to be able to control all the other resources within the organization. So the importance of HRM is growing within the organizations primarily because of things that we've discussed in Learning Outcome 1, which could be to do with workforce diversity. Most companies growing nowadays, having global operations, and the legislation which a lot of these large organizations have to comply with when we look at the working of these organizations within different geographies and countries is important. So let's briefly recap what is the importance of HRM. One of the key things that we look at in terms of the functions of HRM is that they look at recruitment, selection, training, workforce development, dealing with unions, and also looking at evaluation or performance appraisals of the workforce. One of the key things that they do is you now see a chief HR strategy officer or a chief HR officer being a part of every senior, every board within the organization, because they kind of help to establish, the sustainable competitive advantage for the organization. So they need to look at how to develop resources, especially human resources, how to best utilize them, look at productivity and efficiency issues within the organization, and that is where they implement and their role becomes strategic. We also look at some of the other things wherein the HR contributes in building work practices which lead to both in high levels of individual and organizational performance. Now, briefly recapping what is HRM process. So here we are looking at the functions wherein what they do is one of the key roles of HR is to identify the competency of employee or the workforce. They also look at training and development, which means that if the employee and the sales force or the workforce within an organization is up to date in terms of knowledge, skills, they are generally much more productive, much more efficient, and the organization goals are easily achievable or are achieved more easily. The third is that in some cases, the HR process also deals nowadays in the 21st century in terms of retaining the talent within the organization. And that is something that we will study in a separate unit called talent management. And the idea here is that the HR department utilizes different pay, performance, reward techniques to actually retain high-performing employees or talent within the organization to be able to achieve larger level objectives or goals set by the board or the management in the organization. Now, jumping back to the first learning objective, which is looking at the tools that affect HRM, and what are these tools that we look at when we look at the environmental analysis in terms of factors affecting the working of human resources management. So we look at factors like the labor union. I know these are organizations which actually represent workers, and they seek to protect the interest of the workers by working as a collective. So a lot of unions are there in the UK. Just to give you an example, we've got GMB Union, we've got Unison, we've got Unite the Union. Some of these union, are GMB, for example, and Unite is one of the biggest unions in the UK. And when we look at a lot of workers taking collective action, this is done through the balloting route or through the unions route, and that is why one of the factors which would externally, or basically from an environmental perspective, affect the functioning of HRM is the unions. The second is when we look at why do people sign up to become a member of the unions is because they want to be able to look at a collective bargaining, power. So here in this case, the union, if there are a number of members in the union, then the union signs a contract or an agreement between the firm and the employees they represent. And this is primarily done to basically protect or bargain for better wage, working hours, working conditions, and things like that. A current example in this case I would be giving is that when we look at the rail union in particular in the UK, they have been in discussions with the Ministry of Transport with regards to having in some cases the unions are complaining that the initiative by the government has actually unfairly laid off workers. When you look at trains, there was a driver and there is a conductor which basically ensures safety and safety of passengers when the train actually starts or they deboard the train during the station. So that has been removed, and some of the rail companies like Cross Country and other rails have actually done away with one of the staff which was looking after that responsibility along with the driver when the trains were being operated. So here the unions are balloted, and obviously they are now in discussions with the Ministry of Transport to restore employment for some of the employees. And I think a good 700 people have lost jobs because of this particular decision of the company looking at saving costs. So here the factors which affect the normal routine day-to-day functioning of HR from an external perspective is that unions could be considered as well, that factor. Now, the other things that we look at is sometimes the change in law and regulations also limit the managerial discussion or in discretion, in particular decision making in terms of hiring, promoting, and discharging employees. So this is something all companies have to adhere to, and if there's a new change in regulation which is brought, then you will see that this is something which the HR has to adhere to in order to meet and have the compliance in line with the laws or regulations set in that country. I think about a year and a half back or 2 years back, maybe a bit more, there was the government actually raised the national minimum wage, for people in jobs 24 years and over, and that national minimum wage went to £7.65. I think it's gone up to £7.80 an hour. So that was something which all companies will have to adhere to, and that is an implication which is an introduction of law or legislation which has been brought in by the government, and that is something also affecting, human resources department and decision making. When we look at they having to comply with this, which means the cost and the wages go up, the overall wage bill in the organization goes up, and that is something which is seen to be, put into place because of the change of law and regulations within the country. Now, the other learning objective that we were looking at understanding was that what is organizational analysis? Now, if I have to talk in the context of organizational analysis, what does it mean in the context of human resources management? Now, organizational analysis, if we look at it as a term, is more commonly, a term used within the engineering, production, kind of setup, kind of companies, and this is more commonly related to something called industrial analysis. Now, this is a process of reviewing the development, work environment, personnel, and operations of a business with respect to, the sector or the arena in which the business is operating. The review is done primarily in response to, some sort of a crisis. So if suddenly you see the economic climate changing and the companies start to pile up on inventory, or they start, demand in the market goes down, then in that case, this kind of an organizational review or an analysis is put into place. And this is done in order to kind of, curtail costs or, reduce costs so that the business can be, viable, or the business can be, the business operations can be sustained. Now, sometimes you will see that these organizational analyses are done, from an aspect of a regular or a periodic exercise. Most large organizations or global companies which operate in different geographies, what they do is they undertake a review once every 12 to 18 months or once every 3 years, and this is done, as a one of the reasons because of this is done. Let me put it this way: that there are a couple of reasons through which I can define that why this kind of a review is done. One of the reasons and things that I can think of is that it is done by, or it is undertaken by the management because they want to identify problems or issue areas or inefficiencies in the system that are leading to downfall in productivity, or the output in terms of manufacturing or revenue in this case. The second reason could be that some of the organizations do take these organizational analyses is to establish best practices or areas of weakness or gap which can be identified to be improved and then translated or transformed into best practices within the organization. The third reason that I see why this review could be done is that the organization is trying to look into the future and develop a strategy which will actually help it to kind of, ward off competition, or in some cases develop strategies which will make it much more competitive in the market, or when they are trying to bring out new products and offering, and would make it much more competitive in terms of its positioning with regards to its competitors. Now, organizational analysis, when we talk about, it basically focuses on, a couple of things. Now, why do you think an organization will take this up? Now, there are, as I mentioned, 3 or 4 different reasons. One of the reasons is if the company is looking at building capacity, is looking at expanding, is looking at growing, then in that case, the analysis is required to focus on, something called the structure and design. How big the organization needs to grow, how much recruitment needs to be done from an HR perspective, which departments need the additional support, which will support the business and bring in the additional reviews. Those kind of reasons are looked at when we look at, putting together a detailed analysis, which is focused on when the organization is actually growing, the business is growing, expanding. The other reasons could be that sometimes you have to look at differentiating gap areas or issues into internal and external factors, and they have to be accounted for in terms of trying to improve efficiency. So sometimes you will see that within production companies, automobile companies in particular, you will see that the production floor and the engineering department is always looking out to looking out for ways to be able to increase efficiency or improve efficiency. So things like just-in-time, Kaizen, total quality management were brought in primarily because they wanted to look at the availability of spare parts or the availability of production components for production to be made available just in time, so it could help save on inventory costs, transportation costs, logistics costs, and thereby this was being looked at from a point of view of improving efficiency. So you see the simple example of a company operating 3 shifts of 8 hours each with a 1-hour break in the middle, and the idea there is they want the 3 shifts to start at the same time, on time, not at the same time, on time, and finish at time so that the next shift could start. And that is where the organizational analysis helps when the organization is trying to build capacity, improve efficiency, or improve performance. Now, in some businesses you will see, which have been going for a number of years or decades, you will see that this as a tool is used by HR to kind of undertake something called the long-term sustainability strategy for the business. So when you look at large companies like P&G, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, you look at Nestle, Kraft, now these companies have been going for hundreds of years. So here, and they have hundreds, if not thousands of products. So what they want to be able to look at is how do they ensure long-term sustainability from a point of view of organizational analysis. So here they undertake this kind of an analysis using one of the models that I'm going to discuss, not all the models, but one of the models that I will discuss. And they look at this as a model like the McKenzie 7S model. They try and look at improving the long-term sustainability of the organization by taking a review in specific areas of the business to try and improve efficiency or issues which actually provide an impediment or are impediments to the progress of the organization. And in some cases, you will see that restructuring of the organization is vital. It is required in order for the business to survive, and in some cases, it is required for the business to prosper. And sometimes you will see that the HR department will undertake that, will take the organization-wide, review because they want to kind of look at a dire situation wherein the company would go into administration. So what they look at is, you will see that in the market sometimes companies issue profit warnings, and what they try and do is they will try and lay off a lot of staff, reduce the wage bill, reduce the outgoings to the supplier, and these are done as a necessary caution to be able to save the business. So again, related to something called long-term sustainability. Now, what are the tools that we look at when we have to look at the organizational analysis? And there are various tools which are listed. We're going to discuss a few in terms of what could be the tools which the HR department could use to actually look at doing this analysis. Now, the first one is called the strategic triangle. I've taken them up from the book and also from the website, so that is going to be available to you as a handout for you to read in a bit more detail. I've made some of the details of the different models in this slide, but you could read in a bit more detail in the handout that I will provide after this presentation, to develop a deeper understanding into each of the models. Now, some of these models have been evolved over the years, and what we have seen is that different organizations would use different models to do some analysis and review. But let's look at a few to look at and to understand. Now, what is strategic triangle model? Now, here, basically, the model actually relies on 3 calculations within an organization to determine the efficiency, effectiveness of the organization. Now, the first one that we look at in this case is basically, the value or the mission that guides the organization. Second one that we look at is the operational capacity, which means basically the knowledge and the skill set which the employees or the workforce has to be able to carry out the task of the mission. And the third is basically legitimacy and support, or basically the value which financially the organization can actually put into the plan to make that vision or mission actually sustainable or achievable. So using this model, what you will see is that an organization can actually consider if they are able to have a good mission in place, and that is supported by good workforce, and last but not the least is ably financed in terms of financial support, then generally you will see that the organization is able to achieve all the objectives, because all the 3 things which are basically in the strategic triangle model, are uniquely aligned, and the components, because they are aligned, they are favorable to the organizational functioning, and that is why you will see the organization achieving the goals and objectives set by the management. Now, SWOT analysis is a tool that we've used in all places possible, and this is a tool which basically can be used to do some structured review within the organization. A very basic model, but allows us to clearly identify strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and they can be easily classified, within the organization if we have to take this into view, and this particular model for doing some organizational analysis. Now, the only thing that we look at in this case is that sometimes you will see that some of the things that we identify as strengths, weaknesses, or opportunities and threats are actually dependent on the internal and external factors affecting the working of the business. And sometimes if you see that these factors are not aligning with the strengths and weaknesses of the organization, could be, say, the external factor could be law and legislation, internal factor could be, not non-availability or suitability of the workforce, then in that case, what you will see is that the organization will continue to suffer. And the idea there would be the HR department needs to identify, what kind of talent or recruitment they need to do to be able to bridge that gap. And in some cases, the company needs to find ways to make the law and legislation more conducive to the functioning of the, organization from a point of view of its products and services. Now, if they are aligned, you will normally see that there is a strategic fit, and this strategic fit would mean that, the strengths of the business give it an advantage over its competitors. The weakness, of the business are not necessarily disadvantage or putting the business into a bit of a disadvantage at the current moment. Opportunities could be the elements that, the business could look at exploiting to gain advantage, and threats could be the elements of environment that could cause trouble for the business or project, which means that there could be external factors like economic factors, fluctuation in, the currency. It could be things if the business provides or sells products and services abroad. If there is an import and export, then in those cases, they could be affected by the economic conditions which are prevailing in other countries, and those could then pose, some sort of a threat to the organization when HR looks at it. So a threat could be that, from an HR perspective, could be that a competitor comes along and offers to poach your workforce. That means they offer your employees higher salary to be able to, ask them to resign and take them to join in their organization, and that could be considered as an external threat, and that could affect, the working of the organization. Now, there are lots of other tools, but in general, I think one of the most popular tools that we need to discuss and look at is the McKenzie's 7S model. Now, in this particular model, this particular model actually emphasizes the balancing of 7 key aspects of the organization. And these 7 key aspects are hard and soft, elements of the organization. So there are 3 elements, which is strategy, structure, and systems, which are considered hard elements. That means you do not normally compromise on these elements. And then there are the soft or shared elements, which could be staff, skill, style, and value. And when you look at these components and these, different elements working within the organization, you will see that this 7S framework is primarily, interdependent. So you cannot have one functioning without the other. And in this case, what you have to do is these elements that when, say, for example, when the HR department looks at recruiting staff, they have to recruit staff which is keeping in mind, the skill set which is required in the job description, the style and the culture of the organization. They have to have enough useful skills to be able to use the system. And the staff that they are trying to recruit needs to be aware of the structure and also to a certain extent buy into the strategy which has been put forward for them to come in and, work on. So if you see that these 7 elements are working together and are interdependent, you will normally see that, the organization's prospering. But if you see that there is a misalignment or, there is some of the elements are strong and some of the elements are weak, then you normally see that the organization becomes dysfunctional. And in some cases, there is disruption of, normal day-to-day activities of the business as well. Now, there is a handout which I'm going to send along, which basically talks about the 7S checklist. And this checklist, basically provides a set of questions. We look at a situation which is point A, and then we also look at a proposed situation. So you are going from point A, which is unstable, to a point B, which is more stable, and the HR uses this framework to be able to ask a lot of questions which are related to the 7 S's of the model. So strategy, what is our strategy? What is the intent in terms of achieving the objective? So you ask questions which are related to this checklist, and this is something that kind of provides, the kind of some sort of an analysis to the HR manager in terms of the areas which are dysfunctional or non-aligned, or areas which are perfectly aligned. So it is useful to have a look at that particular 7S framework and the questions, because they will help you understand how the HR department and the organization actually looks at using this as a framework to pick out gap areas and inconsistencies between the different elements, and how they look at harmonizing them to try and create an organization which basically is able to achieve the goals and objectives. Now, there are models which have come across over the years. There is a rational model which you can look at. There's a natural system model. There's a cognitive model which is more or less behavior dependent. And here, you will look at the behavioral aspects, which is things like the personal factors, your behavior, your attitude, and the personal goals, and the ability of managers to be able to work personally, build relationship, or networking with staff allows them to get work done in a much more productive and efficient manner. So some of these models are worth knowing, simply because there are lots of tools which are available for organizational analysis, and here the idea would be to at least study 2 or 3 of them, because that is where you need to be able to pick out 1 or 2 of them, like this McKenzie 7S model or the behavioral model, which is the cognitive model, to be able to apply when you start to do your tasks in the assignment. Now, the other thing that we look at in particular would be how do we examine, the development of strategy within the organization. Now, there are various tools available to HR department or HR managers in particular, and they use these tools to look at, understanding how do we look at evaluating the organizational strategy and if this is working or not working. Now, before we get into this, what we need to be able to do is understand some key terms and terminology around, the organizational strategic development. Now, there are some terms like HR metrics or analytics. Now, you've heard about metrics or analytics as a term. For example, Google Analytics. You're looking at basically, number data to be able to, come across to some meaningful results, or, some sort of inferences when we look at collecting data, analyzing that data to come out with meaningful, options, or coming out with meaningful inferences. Now, HR metrics is basically data used to quantify cost. And this is done primarily, when you look at the talent management program, HR processes, and how HR actually looks at, kind of measuring that what initiatives they have taken and what money has been spent. Has that been, well spent? Has that been overspent? Has that, kind of led to some sort of, a useful yield or let's say benefit to the organization? And metrics is when you add value to the organization by providing information which is required to basically take or make decisions. So when you look at HR metrics and analytics, here we are primarily looking at numbers or data which is basically going to be transformed into information, and that is going to be used to take decisions, and also to look at measuring the data being developed into metrics to be able to measure the success of some of the HR initiatives, or some of the programs, schemes, incentives, reward programs which the HR actually puts in place. Now, there is a significant importance of HR metrics. Now, there are lots of different types of tools and techniques which have been developed over the years, and one of the metrics that we look at, in terms of organization, is that how does an HR manager get measured in terms of whether you're doing the job correctly? Is the department functioning properly? Most HR managers are, kind of measured on the fact that how they look at reducing the employee turnover. If you have a lot of churn within employees or people leaving the organization, then it is seen as a detrimental factor, or as a factor directly related to the HR working on HR department. So what we look at is when we look at putting or measuring some of these, metrics, we look at basically, basic things like wherein you will look at how the HR managers are able to manage the HR capital or human resources capital, how they're able to kind of, change them, address them, and then have them working beneficially towards the HR goals and objectives or the organizational goals and objectives in this case. And to a certain extent, we've heard about the terms like the balanced scorecard, we've looked at 360-degree feedback, management by objectives. Now, these are metrics which have been put in place and have been used over the years in order to track and manage the performance of the employees and also to see and drive the direction of HR in particular as a function. Now, let's look at one of the other terms like workforce analytics. Now here, what we do see from research is that human capital is one of the least measured and analyzed investments. That means people don't realize that how much money is being put into human resources development, training, recruitment. And sometimes you will see that despite the fact that more than 70% of the company costs are labor related, that means wages, staff related, recruitment related, you will see that still there is no matrix or some sort of an analysis being done at the HR level, at the board level, to understand how much is spent on this particular function. So here, when we look at analytics or some sort of matrix being put in place, you will normally see that the senior level executives put this into places because they want to keep a firm grasp on the recruitment, training, development costs within the organization. Now, this is a direct cost which can be saved in organizations provided, this is structured, this is monitored, and this is evaluated, closely evaluated, by the senior management across the year. Sometimes you will see that, in some organizations, when you're recruiting somebody and you're not able to find the talent or you're not able to find people to be able to work in that job role, what the companies would do is they'll up their recruitment costs to say, okay, if you're not able to find a candidate, let's up that cost to a certain salary level wherein you'll be able to find candidates. But sometimes you will see that these kind of investments are not justified from a business case point of view. And in those cases, you will see that, the analytics or some sort of a matrix is put in place to try and see that, okay, this is something which was done in the past but has not worked, so it should not be tried out in the future. Now, there are stages of workforce analytics, and this has been proposed by the Gartner Group, which has undertaken a lot of research over the years. And what they say is that, when this kind of a matrix is put into place or some sort of a measurement technique has been put into place by a company, they have done it for 4 basic reasons. One is they want to look at basic reporting. That means they want a regulatory reporting which seems to be automated, and that tends to give them feedback in terms of, give them feedback in terms of the normal day-to-day functioning of the employees or workforce within the organization. Now, an example of this would be a clocking meter, or for example, you have your clock check-in and check-out, or clock in and clock out cards when you see workers or people working within factories or production lines. So here the idea is basic reporting. They want to know how many people came into the shift on time, how many people left on time, and they want to reasonably automate this as a system, because what they see is that this is a basic of why they want to measure or have analytics in place. The second is sometimes managers look at access to information they want to get hold of, and this is primarily to measure key performance indicators. Now, this is done, and this can only be done if there are some benchmarks which are set in place or measurements or metrics which are put in place which are able to measure the key performance indicators. The third is HR uses this in a different form, and they use this to basically look at doing detailed workforce analysis. That means once given a job description, how you performed towards the end of the year when your performance appraisal happened, they look at various techniques to kind of slice and dice your performance to see what could have been done differently to improve that performance, or what could have been done significantly. If the training would have been given, would it significantly improve your performance and the revenue or the output that you got for the organization? Last but not the least, you will see that sometimes data is required in general, to look at predictive decision making, and this normally happens in places where organizations have large workforce, and they will use this, as a tool to basically look at predictive analysis within the organization. Organizations like Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Apple, where you have 100,000 plus employees working within the organization, analytics is a key part of tools, is one of the key part, or part and parcel of the HR toolkit, which is used to basically look at doing predictive analysis on human resources within the organization. Now, this is a chart which was done, and basically it shows that why do companies use analytics or put some sort of a matrix in place. And these are factors which have been ranked that, employee surveys, productivity, training hours are some of the key factors why organizations undertake, or put together some sort of matrix. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier before, that from an HR perspective, they look at matrix or some sort of analysis being done in order to look at a couple of things. Productivity, how do they increase productivity of the employees working within the organization? And to a certain extent, how do they improve the efficiency or the output which the employee gives in order to maximize productivity? So there are various reasons why these are put in place, and these are tools and techniques which the HR manager uses, the HR department uses in order to kind of analyze the strategic development, or in order to promote the strategic development of the achievement of goals and objectives within the organization. Now, there are lots of things which are required, but one of the key things required is that if there is no employee engagement, then some of these metrics or analytics do not work. So what has been proven by research is that if you have engaged workers within the organization, then you see more productivity. If you see that workers are disengaged and do not have faith within the management or leadership of the organization, that you will see that some of the workers who are engaged also get disengaged because they get undermined by workers who are not working to deliver the goals and objectives set by the organization. Now, what drives engagement? Obviously, motivation, leadership behavior, rewards. I could add things like rewards, incentive, perks, basically add to employee engagement. So long term, when you see you have to retain employees and talents within the organization, you will see that the HR manager they include something called the employee stock option plan, so that if they want to retain talent, they give them stock options which can be divested in the future, giving them additional income, and this then becomes one of the factors that can be used to drive engagement within the organization. Now, this particular slide nicely summarizes why analytics are required in modern day HR and modern day organizations. So there are different phases through which HR looks at measuring the performance of the employee, the productivity of the employee, the efficiency of the employees, their contribution towards the achievement of organizational goals and objectives, and what kind of an impact they can have in terms of bringing the change across within the organization. This is very nicely being summarized on this particular chart, and it is a good summary that HR uses metrics or analytics primarily to help them within recruitment and talent management, to look at measuring employee satisfaction, job satisfaction nowadays, and engagement. And last but not the least, to do cost analysis, or to ensure how effective the costs are being spent or managed, from an HR perspective, when they look at primarily, the aspect of, workforce recruitment and selection within the organization. So I hope with this particular, discussion today, we've been able to understand the key two critical factors, in terms of objectives would be to understand, the impact of, external environment on the HR functioning within the organization, and also the role of, human resources management in development of the organizational strategy and its measurement using analytics and, metrics set, and the tools and techniques used to measure them within the, setup. So with this, I would like to thank you for attending this session today. Any questions and queries that you have, please feel free to raise them through email or the chat room. I am going to send across this deck of slides to you on email, along with a handout which will help you understand some of the concepts and develop a deeper understanding into the, the research models that we've talked about, which are used by HR in particular to do organizational analysis. Once again, thank you for attending the session today, and I will catch up with you tomorrow with the next learning outcome for this particular unit. Thanks.